A body found in a candlelit corridor, and not a soul claims to have seen a thing. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. We've built something special here. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I always look forward to your messages. They truly bring this journey to life. Let's begin. It was a Tuesday, and Margaret had risen earlier than usual, though there was no particular reason to. The air in the apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir was cool, the kind of lingering autumn damp that settled into the walls and floorboards. Madame Margaret had left the bedroom curtains half open, so a pale light filtered through, grey and uncertain, like the mood that clung to Paris when it couldn't decide whether to rain or not. He padded softly across the wooden floor, slippers whispering, careful not to wake her. The kettle on the stove began to sputter, and he let it, watching the steam curl lazily as he stood with his hands tucked deep in the pockets of his thick wool dressing gown. It was not often that he had mornings to himself, with no summons to Quai des Orfèvres or a case lingering like an unfinished letter on his desk. But even on those days, he was not idle. His mind wandered, not in leaps but in slow looping circles around the faces he had seen, the voices he remembered, and sometimes the silences that had meant more than anything said aloud. He sat by the window, coffee in hand, watching the sparse traffic below. A delivery boy struggled with a stack of crates on a bicycle. A woman with a small dog paused at the corner, frowning up at the sky. It was all so ordinary, so drabbily alive. When Madame Maigret finally appeared, her dressing gown neat, her dark hair brushed but still damp at the temples, he smiled faintly. She brought with her the scent of rosewater and starch. "You're not going in today." "I might. You'll catch a chill sitting like that." He didn't answer, only took another sip. She didn't press. It was an hour later, just as he had shaved and begun to dress, that the telephone rang in the hallway. Not a sharp ring, but the persistent one, the kind meant for him. He let it ring 3 times before answering. "Maigret, Inspector, sorry to bother you at home. There's been a death out near Montfaujon, a boarding inn. The local brigade's there already, but someone thought you might be interested. Nothing official really. What kind of death? Suicide, they say. But the innkeeper, she insists something's wrong. Says the man didn't seem the type." Maigret waited, breathing evenly into the receiver. "Name? René Chabut. Traveling salesman. Stayed the night. Quiet fellow, apparently. No note." He could hear the hesitation in the man's voice. A suicide with no note, no family nearby, and no one particularly shocked. These happened often enough. But someone, a local gendarme, or maybe just the innkeeper's voice, had stirred something vague but undeniable. Maigret replaced the receiver gently, and looked at the rain beginning to bead against the window pane. Madame Maigret was folding towels. She glanced at him without stopping. "Do you want your umbrella?" "I think I'll take the train," he said. "You'll be late for lunch." He kissed her on the cheek, picked up his hat and coat, and stepped out into the hushed morning, the cobbles already glistening beneath his feet. As he walked toward Gare de Lyon, Maigret's thoughts did not fix on the dead man but on the inn, a place he hadn't yet seen but could already imagine. Wooden stairs worn down in the center, the smell of cooked cabbage in the hallway, perhaps a cat curled on the radiator, and somewhere behind one of those wallpapered doors was a silence that didn't sit quite right. Not urgent, just wrong. "Would you like me to continue with the next section, or pause here for now?" The train swayed gently as it left the outskirts of Paris, the dull rhythm of wheels on tracks lulling most of the other passengers into quiet. Maigret sat near the window, his overcoat folded on his lap, watching as grey buildings gave way to thinning suburbs, then fields wet with early rain. Occasionally he sipped from a lukewarm coffee in a paper cup, the taste bitter but oddly comforting. He wasn't thinking of René Chabut, not yet, not directly. His thoughts were still circling the word inn, the kind that still lingered along country roads, a little removed from the modern pulse of things. A place that wasn't quite rural, but not quite of the city either. Somewhere people came not for business, but to disappear for a night or two. Traveling salesmen, divorced clerks, quiet, unremarkable men with little noise in their lives. The station at Montgeron was small, one low building with a platform half shielded from the rain. A constable met him, cap slightly askew, the skin beneath his eyes purpled with fatigue. He introduced himself as Marchand. "She's waiting for you, the woman who runs the place," he said as they walked toward the car. Madame Vernou, old, sharp as a tack. "She insisted someone from Paris come," said the fellow's manner didn't match the end he got. "What end was that?" Marchand hesitated, hung himself, belt on a hook behind the door. Nothing special about it except, well, he'd shaved, laid out his coat real neat, but he still had a fresh loaf of bread in his bag. Cheese, too, paid for 2 nights. They drove in silence after that. Rain tapped lightly on the windshield, the wipers moving in slow, reluctant intervals. The road narrowed as they left the main street, lined with poplars that stood dripping, their leaves half-turned, yellow and trembling. The inn came into view just past a curve, a squat, 2-story building with cracked shutters and a sagging iron sign that read Auberge des Ombres. The paint was faded, the gravel drive soaked and patchy. It looked like the kind of place where someone might spend a night and be forgotten by morning. Inside, the front room was low-ceilinged and warm, smelling of boiled potatoes and stove ash. A cat blinked lazily from a chair near the hearth. Madame Vernou stood behind the counter, small and firm-jawed, her hair pinned in a grey knot. She didn't speak at once, just looked Maigret up and down as if measuring him against something unseen. "I've seen men who didn't want to live anymore," she said without preamble. "They don't buy fresh bread. They don't ask what time breakfast is served." Maigret removed his hat and nodded. He seemed calm, she continued. Too calm, maybe, but not done with life. She led them up a narrow staircase, its banister polished smooth by years of use. The hallway smelled faintly of damp wood and something sweet, an old cologne perhaps. Room 4 was at the end, its door open, the bed already stripped. The hook behind the door was ordinary, slightly bent. A faint scuff marked the wall near the floor where presumably the man's shoe had rubbed. Maigret stood still in the center of the room, breathing slowly, eyes moving. On the dresser sat a cracked leather satchel, neatly arranged, socks, shirts, a pair of gloves, a wrapped package of cheese and the loaf of bread, untouched. A tiny tin of mustache wax. He ran his finger along the rim of the wash basin, damp, used recently. The mirror was fogged slightly on the edges, as if it had once held the breath of someone not quite resolved. He said his name was Chabut, Maigret asked. "Yes, René Chabut, from Lyon," he said. "But the address he gave, I don't think it exists." Madame Vernou paused, then added quietly. He looked behind him when he walked, as if someone might follow. Maigret nodded again. The silence in the room was not oppressive but strange, as though something had ended too soon. Not like a life, but like a sentence that had no period. He turned to Marchand. "Has anyone claimed the body?" "No, no family listed." Maigret stared at the closed wardrobe, dust on the handle, the shoes beneath the bed still wet on the soles. "Not from this room." "Send a man to the cafe down the road," he said quietly, "and to the tobacconist. Someone must have seen him before he came here." He remained in the room a moment longer, alone. A fly buzzed half-heartedly against the glass. The belt, removed now, lay coiled like a question on the edge of the dresser. Nothing about it screamed murder. Nothing about it screamed suicide either. It was just... The drizzle had thickened into a steady, slanting rain by the time Maigret left the upstairs room. Outside, the gutters overflowed with leaves, water slapping softly at the gravel. In the inn's front room, Madame Vernou had taken her place once more behind the desk, knitting now, her needles clicking faintly. She did not look up as he approached. "Did he speak much?" Maigret asked. "No, not one for chatter. Polite, quiet, the kind who says please when you hand him a key." Her eyes never left the wool. "Did he have a drink that evening?" "A beer, just the one. Sat by the stove, read the newspaper. Didn't say good night, just nodded and went upstairs." "And you noticed nothing strange? No visitors, no phone calls?" Madame Vernou stopped knitting. "We haven't had a working phone for a week. The lines out here go bad every time it rains more than a day." She looked at him now. "As for visitors, I've run this place since my husband died. I hear every door that opens, every floorboard that creaks. No one came for him. He was entirely alone." Maigret nodded, then turned to Marchand, who stood by the window, arms crossed, looking uncomfortable. "Anyone turn up at the tobacconist?" "One of the boys we sent is still there," Marchand said. "The other checked the cafe down the lane. The boy who works there remembered him. Said he came in around 6, ordered a coffee, sat by himself, asked where he could find a quiet inn. That was all. No one followed. No one saw." Maigret stood quietly for a moment, chewing the inside of his cheek. "Have you checked the name?" he asked. "René Chabut?" Marchand nodded. "We ran it through Lyon. No match, no birth record, no known address, no travel papers either, under that name." Maigret sighed, stepped to the window and watched a bus pass slowly, windshield wipers wagging like metronomes. Rain traced soft paths down the glass. No one who called himself René Chabut had ever existed, and yet a man of flesh and blood had hanged himself, or been hanged, in room 4 of a modest country inn. He returned upstairs alone, this time not to examine the room but to sit in it. There was something in the air, not a clue exactly, but a feeling. The sort that settled in Maigret's bones, slow and damp, like the weather. He sank into the armchair near the small window and lit his pipe. The smell of stale wool rose faintly from the upholstery. He watched the blurred shapes outside, people with umbrellas moving through the mist, the inn's cat slinking beneath a bench for cover. In such a place, things didn't happen quickly, motives didn't flare, they simmered. On the dresser, the man's effects remained as they were. Wallet empty of anything but a 20-franc note, a ticket stub from a cinema in Lyon, old at least 2 weeks, and a pressed daisy folded in tissue paper. No letters, no photographs, but there were always traces. Even in anonymity, people left marks of themselves. He picked up the satchel again, this time examining it more carefully. Worn leather, but well kept. The initials embossed faintly on the underside flap, CR. He frowned, not RC. CR, Chabut, if that was even the name, had borrowed this bag. or inherited it, or stolen it. He checked the shirts, laundered but not uniformly. Some had faint initials stitched near the hem, again CR. One of the collars was frayed, the kind of detail you noticed only when trying to leave your life behind, or preserve someone else's. There was something else, a book of matches from a bar in Toulon, tucked between two socks. On the inside, a name written in pencil, faint and quick, Annie. He held it between his fingers for a moment, then placed it gently on the table beside the belt. Back downstairs, Martian looked up with that mixture of professional detachment and rural doubt that Maigret knew well. "Do you think he was running from someone?" Martian asked. Maigret didn't answer immediately. He rubbed the stem of his pipe with his thumb. "Have the matches analyzed, the writing, and the initials. Find anyone in Toulon connected to the name Annie. Link to the initials, CR. I want hotel registries, marriage records, police reports, quiet inquiries, no noise." Martian frowned. "That'll take time. Let it." He left the inn and walked slowly down the lane. Coat collar turned up, hat pulled low. The rain was steady but not harsh, the kind that didn't drive people inside but made them move slower, quieter. It made conversations shorter, glances longer. The cafe was small and clean. 2 men at the bar, one of them nodding at Maigret's entrance. The boy behind the counter looked up, wide-eyed. Barely 17, pale with a hint of acne on his chin. He wore a brown apron, too large for his thin frame. "You saw him last night?" Maigret asked. The boy nodded. "He came in just before 6, asked for a coffee, then sat by the window, didn't say much." "Did he seem nervous?" The boy hesitated. "Not really, just kept looking outside. Not like someone waiting for a friend, more like someone checking the street." "Did he talk to anyone?" "No sir, but I think he was listening." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "There were 2 men by the door," the boy explained. "Locals. They were talking about the trains. One of them said the line south was delayed again. Something about a freight accident near Sens. The man, the one who died, he seemed to listen to that very carefully." Maigret stood still. Was that before or after he asked about the inn? Before, right after he heard about the train. He thanked the boy and stepped outside again. The train. If Chabut, or whoever he was, had been planning to leave, had he stayed at the inn only because he was forced to wait? It wasn't the action of a man who had decided to end his life. It was the behavior of someone who needed a place to vanish for a night. The question was, from whom? At the station, the clerk confirmed that no one had purchased a ticket under the name Chabut, but the description matched a man who had asked about the next departure for Dijon the previous afternoon, then left without buying. Maigret jotted it down in his notebook. The pieces didn't yet fit, but they were beginning to show shape. A man with a false name, a borrowed bag, listening closely to the status of trains, and a pressed daisy in his pocket, the kind kept by someone remembering a woman. In the morning he would wire Toulon. For now he returned to the inn, where Madame Vernou handed him a small envelope with thin lips. This was found in the waste bin, burned mostly, but Maigret took it gently. Inside were fragments, a corner of stationery, faint blue, and a smear of handwriting. Not enough to read, just enough to haunt. The rest of the night, Maigret stayed in room 4, sitting in the armchair, listening to the sounds of the house, pipes groaning, distant footsteps, rain against the shutters. The room held its silence like a confession withheld. By morning, he knew he would need to go south, to Toulon, to Annie, to whoever CR had once been. The morning brought no change in weather. The clouds hung thick and low over Montgeron, and the rain came in short, indecisive bursts. In the dining room of the inn, Maigret sat at a square table by the window, sipping black coffee that tasted slightly of the stove. Madame Vernou had placed a plate of warm bread and a wedge of local cheese before him without a word. He ate slowly, watching the fog lift from the gravel drive. He was thinking, not about the scene upstairs, but about Toulon, a place he hadn't visited in years. Toulon, where sea breezes carried the smell of oil and salt, where sailors crowded the bars by dusk, and where a man like CR, whoever he had been, might have found both refuge and trouble. Maigret entered quietly and handed Maigret a telegram. It was from the Toulon precinct, sparse but telling. No Chabut. Possible match. Charles Renaud, age 43. Left job at shipyard, suddenly 3 weeks ago. No known address. Associated with woman Annie Berthault, 29, barmaid, Brasserie de Naviers. Maigret folded the telegram and let it rest beside his plate. So, not Renaud Chabut, Charles Renaud. A name that fit the initials in the bag. The story was no longer that of a salesman passing through. It was becoming something else. A man running not from obscurity, but from a life that had known disappointment, perhaps disgrace. The inn had quieted again. The guests, few as they were, had gone. A truck driver, a middle-aged couple from Dijon. Maigret took one last sip, wiped his lips, and found Madame Vernou folding a tea towel near the stove. "Have you ever been to Toulon, madame?" he asked. She raised an eyebrow at the question. "Once. My sister lived there, before the war. I didn't care for it. Too loud, too bright, not for people who need quiet." Maigret nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think he needed quiet?" She turned the towel in her hands. "Yes, but not peace. There's a difference." The train south left just after noon. Maigret sat again by the window, the countryside rolling past in rain-muted colors, ochre fields, gray villages, blurred trees. He read over the telegram once more. Charles Renaud. a name with no weight yet, just a shadow where a man had been. At the Toulon station the clouds had thinned, the air smelled of wet stone and engine grease. A taxi took him down to the port district, where the Brasserie des Navires stood near the docks, a squat building with salt-worn shutters and a wooden sign faded by sun. Inside, the smell of beer and tobacco lingered even in the early hour. A few men hunched over glasses, muttering about the weather. The barmaid looked up as he entered, not startled but wary. She was younger than he'd expected, late 20s perhaps, with hair dyed too dark and skin that showed signs of fatigue behind the powder. Her hands moved constantly, straightening napkins, wiping spots that didn't exist. "Annie Bertol?" Maigret asked, his tone soft. She nodded slowly as if bracing for what would follow. "I'm Chief Inspector Maigret from Paris." That made her pause. She set the cloth down, visibly stiffened. "It's about Charles Renaud," he continued. "You knew him." She hesitated. "Knew, not well. He came here often, but he kept to himself." Maigret said nothing, only waited, his presence filling the silence. Annie's gaze faltered. "He was kind," she said at last. "The kind of man who asked how your mother was, even if he didn't know her name. Quiet, but sad, I suppose. I don't know what he did before. Worked at the shipyard. Only for a while." "When did he stop coming?" "About 3 weeks ago. He left a note with Gerard, the bartender. Said he was going north, that he wouldn't be back." "Did he say why?" Annie shook her head, but I could tell he was scared. Maigret lit his pipe slowly. "Of what?" "I don't know, but the last time I saw him, he jumped when someone slammed a glass. And once, he asked me if I believed people could vanish, just like that. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. There was more. He felt it hanging in the air between them, reluctant but undeniable. "Was there something between you?" he asked gently. Annie's face darkened slightly, but she didn't look away. "Not exactly. He was kind to me, that's all. And once he brought me a daisy, pressed in a book, said it reminded him of something good." Maigret nodded. "Did he ever mention the name Chobut?" "No." He stood. "Do you know where he was staying before he left?" She hesitated again. "There was a woman, a widow, Madame Loussat. She rents a room or two, near the station. He might have stayed there. She never asks questions." By the time Maigret arrived at Madame Loussat's, the afternoon sun had pierced the cloud cover, casting the narrow alley in yellow light. The building was old, its plaster chipped, with rust creeping up the base of the iron stairway. Madame Loussat opened the door herself, thin, tight-lipped, wearing a shawl even in the warmth. She did not smile. "Yes, he stayed here," she said when Maigret showed the telegram. "Paid in cash, left no name, cleaned up after himself, quiet." "Did he receive visitors?" "One man, short, thick neck, wore a blue overcoat, came late, twice." "Did you hear anything?" Voices, tense, but not shouting. Maigret raised his eyes to hers. "Would you recognize the man?" "I might." He handed her his card. Back at the brasserie, Annie had returned to her routine. When she saw Maigret again, she looked uncertain. "Did you love him?" he asked, not unkindly. She blinked. "No, not exactly. But I think he loved someone once, and lost them. You can tell when someone's carrying that weight." Maigret thanked her, and stepped back into the street. The air was heavier now. The scent of the sea was stronger. Back in his room at the Hôtel de la Mer, he sat by the open window, pipe in hand, and thought about a man named Charles Renaud, who had tried to change his name, distance himself from something that still clung to him. A man who bought cheese and bread, and pressed flowers into tissue. A man who flinched at loud sounds, and who once asked if people could disappear, but they never did. Not really. Even the ones who wanted to most left behind traces, daisy petals, initials stitched into shirt hems, matchbooks with a woman's name penciled in. Maigret knew now, this wasn't the story of a man fleeing punishment. It was the story of a man whose guilt had already passed sentence. He looked out at the port lights flickering through dusk. Somewhere the man in the blue overcoat was still out there, waiting, watching. By morning, Toulon had returned to grey. The sky was a low ceiling pressing over the harbour, and the cries of gulls echoed in the stillness. Maigret rose early, foregoing breakfast, and walked to the police commissariat, just off Rue de l'Intendance. The inspector on duty, a thin, hollow-cheeked man with tobacco-stained fingers, met him in a dim office that smelled of damp paper and worn furniture. "You want old tenant records?" he asked, frowning. "We've got names, but no guarantees. Renaud was a quiet one. Nothing on him before this?" Maigret tapped the folder in his hand, which held only the matchbook, the daisy and the telegram. "Only suggestions, no facts." The Toulon inspector nodded grimly and handed Maigret a sheet with a list of local boarding houses and known associates linked to former shipyard workers. "You'll want to talk to Lucas Brégard. Used to work dispatch at the yard. Knew everyone. Drinks now, mostly. You'll find him at the Café Nautique around 11. Never earlier. He can't manage coffee without a beer beside it." Maigret thanked him and stepped back out into the wind. The Café Nautique sat at the edge of the docks, facing moored trawlers with peeling paint and empty nets. Inside, the floorboards creaked underfoot, and the counter was scarred from years of elbows and arguments. At precisely 11, a figure emerged from the back, stooped and ruddy-faced, wearing a blue overcoat that had clearly survived better days. Brégard. He walked with a limp, and the heavy air of a man who had once been necessary and now wasn't. When he saw Maigret, his mouth twisted into a crooked grin. "You're the Paris man," he said, pulling out a chair across from Maigret. Haven't had one of you in years. Usually it's someone younger, meaner. Maigret shrugged. I don't need to be mean. Brégard laughed, a dry wheeze of sound, then signaled the bartender for 2 drinks. Beer for him, coffee for Maigret. I'm looking for a man who might have come to see Charles Renaud 3 weeks ago. Maigret began. Short, heavy-set, blue coat like yours. Like mine? Brégard looked amused. Everyone down here has a coat like mine. You should ask for something rarer, like clean boots or a conscience. Could have been a former colleague. Brégard's expression dimmed. I worked dispatch for 15 years, saw every face on those slips. Renaud, he wasn't here long, but he wasn't stupid. Quiet, yes, but not soft. He left quick, didn't he? Maigret nodded. Brégard stared into his beer. It's not the kind of job you leave without a reason. You get hired to disappear into a rhythm. Renaud broke it. That's always suspicious. Maigret leaned forward slightly. You saw someone visit him. You saw some. I didn't say that, but you might know who would. Brégard hesitated, then scratched his beard. There's a fellow, Raymond Tissot, dock foreman before he was let go for drinking. Used to run errands off the books, favors, messages. If someone wanted to find Renaud discreetly, he'd be the man. Maigret made a note. Where can I find him? Docks, usually around the bait sheds, pretending to work. When Maigret found Tissot 2 hours later, the man was hunched beside a crate, cigarette dangling from his lips. He had a thick neck, meaty hands, and eyes that flinched at every noise. His coat, blue, oil-stained, clung damp to his shoulders. Tissot, Maigret said quietly. The man startled. Who's asking? Maigret, from Paris. I'm investigating a death. A man you might have met, Charles Renaud. Tissot froze for a moment, then laughed nervously. Renaud? Haven't heard that name in a month. You saw him before he left. Tissot's eyes flicked to either side. I ran into him once, said he was heading north, didn't want company, but someone wanted to see him. You arranged it. Listen, I don't know what you think. Maigret took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. He's dead. Hung in a boarding room outside Paris, with a belt. Tissot's mouth fell open. Dead. Tissot swallowed hard. I just passed a message. Whose? Tissot wiped his face with a shaking hand. I don't know his name. Just a guy. Business type. Came in clean, coat and gloves. Didn't look like the rest of us. Asked me to find Renaud. Said it was urgent, personal. What did you tell Renaud? Only that someone wanted to see him. He said no. Said if the man came again, I should say he was gone. But he wasn't. Tissot nodded, sweat beading on his brow. He was scared. You could tell. Something in his eyes. Like he'd been running a long time, and was running out of places. Maigret took a slow breath. Would you recognize the man who gave you the message? Tissot hesitated. I might. Good, you're going to help me. That afternoon, Maigret returned to the Brasserie de Navires. Annie was there again, wiping down the counter. He's dead, isn't he? She said as he entered. Maigret nodded. She looked down, then steadied herself. I suppose I already knew. You don't press flowers if you're planning to stay. Maigret sat at the bar. He was being followed, or sought out. Someone he didn't want to see. Annie said nothing. You're sure he didn't talk about anyone? Old business? Money? Past debts? Her lips tightened. There was something once, just once. He'd had a glass too many. He said he used to work for someone. Called him le client. Always the client, never a name. He said he'd carried things, messages, documents. Said he didn't ask questions, and that's what kept him alive. Criminal work? I don't know. Maybe not even illegal, but dangerous. The kind of work where knowing too much made you a risk. He said he'd left, but I don't think he ever really escaped. Maigret looked down at his notebook. Le client. The words meant little yet, but the tone in Annie's voice suggested they had meant everything to Renaud. That evening he met with Marchand by telephone, briefing him. He asked for discreet inquiries in Paris, business records, known aliases, anything tied to high-value correspondence, black market dealings, or corporate espionage in Toulon during the last 5 years. Someone with enough reach to scare a man into hiding, Maigret said. Not a gangster. Someone clean. He hung up and returned to his hotel room. The port beyond the shutters was cloaked in mist. A ferry's horn sounded low and distant, and gulls cried out as they circled in the dusk. Renaud had been part of something, not a crime but a machine. One that valued silence and punished disobedience without ceremony. A man like that didn't leave letters. He left pressed daisies, and now there was Le Client, a faceless man with polished gloves who sent messengers instead of coming himself. A man who waited for things to unravel. But Maigret didn't believe in men without faces. Sooner or later someone always turned their head, looked back, opened a door. It was just a matter of being there to see it. The next morning brought with it a thin sliver of sun, fractured by passing clouds. The streets of Toulon glistened with the remnants of overnight rain, puddles pooling between cracks in the quay. Maigret stood outside the Brasserie de Navires, pipe lit, coat draped over one arm, watching the sailors come and go like gulls returning to water. He'd been thinking through the night, not of Charles Renaud's death in Montcheron, but of the silence that had led him there, silence in the form of cautious words, glances toward doors, people half spoken of. It was the silence of someone who knew that speaking too plainly could cost more than a reputation. It could end things. Inside the cafe, Annie was setting chairs out along the wall. She nodded at Maigret, not asking anything. They'd crossed into a quiet understanding. He didn't question her heart, and she didn't pretend she had answers. By 10, Maigret was at the Toulon precinct again, meeting with the local inspector in a small side office that overlooked the back lot. "We've got a possible," the inspector said, sliding over a file. "Corporate courier business dissolved 2 years ago. Offshore accounts, vague shareholders, ran a lot of confidential errands, contracts too clean, too ambiguous." Maigret opened the folder. At the top was a name, Maurice Legrand. "A name like Legrand never gets mentioned until someone needs something forgotten," the inspector added dryly. "3 former employees have disappeared in the last 5 years. No charges, just vanished." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "And Renault? There's no paper trail. But one of the names that shows up in passing, a minor contractor, is Charles Renault, attached to a set of shipments marked internal documents, the type that aren't meant to be seen." The inspector pulled out a photo from a separate envelope. A man in his early 50s, handsome in a careful administrative way, trim mustache, expensive coat, a watch chain visible even in the photograph. "That's Legrand. Lives part-time in Paris, part-time in Geneva, travels often. But he was in Toulon 3 weeks ago." Briefly, Maigret looked down at the face, calm, curated, the face of a man who didn't shout, who never rushed, who waited until others tripped over their own panic. "Get me the hotel register," Maigret said. They found it at Hotel Provençal, a narrow building tucked between an antique dealer and a shuttered bakery. Legrand had stayed one night, registered under his own name, with no forwarding address. Maigret stood at the front desk, running his hand along the polished wood. "Did he receive any visitors?" he asked the woman behind the counter, a sallow-skinned concierge with quick eyes. "No visitors," she said, "but he left quickly, barely touched the breakfast." "Did he say anything?" "He asked if we had a fax machine, then asked for a map." "What kind of map?" She paused. "Train lines. Regional." Maigret made his way slowly back toward the port. Something was forming now. Not a plot, not yet a crime, but a design. Renault hadn't stumbled north. He'd fled, and someone had anticipated his route. Back at the inn in Montgeron, the timeline was clearer. Renault, using the name Chabot, had arrived quietly, registered with care, and remained cautious. But that calm was broken not by the appearance of someone, but by the threat of it. He had been waiting, not for safety but for confirmation, a sign that he had failed to disappear. Maigret returned to Toulon station house that afternoon, where Marchand had sent a wire. "Paris confirms Legrand active contact. Private sector ties. 2 employees from same period deceased. Suspicious circumstances. No formal inquiries. No bureaucratic speak. Carefully distanced. It meant only one thing. Legrand moved in a space where inquiries were discouraged, where legality and impropriety mingled in the same glass. That evening, Maigret asked Annie to join him at a quiet cafe inland, far from the docks. It was a modest place, with yellowed curtains and a zinc counter, the kind favored by pensioners and civil servants. "I need your help," Maigret said simply. Annie looked surprised. "Me? But I need someone who knew Renault. Someone who might react if this man Legrand shows his face again." Annie said nothing for a long time. "Then you think he'll come back? Not here, to Paris, or somewhere nearby. He won't trust that the silence will last. Not now." "Why not?" "Because men like Legrand aren't afraid of law. They're afraid of exposure." That night, Maigret returned to the Hotel de la Mer and wrote 2 letters, one to Madame Vernou, instructing her to inform him immediately if any stranger returned to inquire about Chabot, and one to his wife, thanking her for sending along clean socks and his heavier coat. The domesticity of the second letter, he felt, brought balance to the first. When he returned to Paris the next day, the sky had turned again, this time to a brittle blue. Quai des Orfèvres smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. Inspector Lognon, ever gloomy, greeted him with a shrug and an unlit cigarette dangling from his lip. "Back already?" Lognon muttered. "I thought you were finally taking a holiday." Maigret didn't answer. He reviewed the file again. Renault's face stared up from a grainy ID photo. Middle-aged, clean-shaven, wearing an expression of cautious compliance. Not the face of a man who fled in panic. A man who waited too long, maybe. He set a quiet plan in motion. Tissot was brought discreetly to Paris and lodged in a cheap hotel under a false name. Annie followed 2 days later, registered as a cousin of one of the typists. Neither knew exactly what they were part of, only that Maigret had asked. And when he asked like this, quietly, steadily, people rarely refused. By the 4th day, Legrand arrived. He checked into the Hotel Verviers in the 6th arrondissement, under his real name. No attempt to hide. His kind rarely did. They didn't fear the law. They feared only the moment someone saw them for what they were. Maigret waited. That afternoon, he arranged for Tissot and Annie to be seated in the café across the street. Not to confront, not to accuse, just to watch. Legrand would see them. He would register their faces. And if guilt existed in him, even as a hairline crack, it would widen. When Legrand emerged from the hotel lobby, briefcase in hand, coat crisp, Maigret watched from the corner. The man paused at the café, eyes flicking to Annie, then Tissot. The faintest hitch in his step, not a stumble, but a shift, A recalculation, and that was all Maigret needed. He approached slowly, deliberately. "Monsieur Legrand," he said, as if greeting an acquaintance. Legrand turned, composed. "Yes?" "Maigret, Chief Inspector," a faint smile. "I'm not aware of any investigation involving me." "No," Maigret said gently, "but I'm aware of several that were stopped just short of you." Legrand's expression didn't change, but he did not move. "I have no evidence," Maigret continued, "only names, Renault, 2 others, all connected by employment, all dead, and now 2 witnesses. Not enough to charge, but enough perhaps for questions to start again." Legrand's voice, when it came, was very soft. "You know what happened?" Maigret shook his head. "I know a man died with a belt around his neck and a daisy in his pocket. That's not evidence, monsieur, it's memory." Legrand turned and walked away without another word, and Maigret, standing in the cooling light of afternoon, did not follow. He never needed to, because silence, like guilt, always found its way to the surface. 2 days passed. Legrand did not leave Paris. He remained at the Hotel Verviers, coming and going with quiet precision. Breakfast was taken alone, no visitors, no long walks. A man who understood that visibility was now a liability. And yet, he didn't run. He had nothing to run from, not legally, and men like Legrand rarely fled in the face of shadows, but Maigret knew better. In his experience, the truly dangerous men didn't crack under pressure, they decayed under silence. It wasn't confrontation they feared, it was stillness. A stillness in which questions weren't asked but waited, growing louder each time. Nothing was said. In the meantime, Maigret said nothing to his superiors at the Quai. There was no report to file, no case to submit. The death in Montauban had been ruled a suicide. The body had been claimed by no one. Charles Renault or Chabot had left no family, no will, not even a real name. The official channels had already let the matter rest, but Maigret didn't work in channels, he worked in currents. On the 3rd morning he returned to the inn at Montauban. Madame Vernou met him with her usual dry nod, her mouth drawn into a permanent line of suspicion and quiet dignity. "You're still chasing shadows, Inspector." "Always," he replied. The inn was nearly empty. A traveling couple had left that morning, and the other guest, a widower from Rouen, had not stirred from his room. Maigret sat once more in room 4, the same chair by the small window, pipe in hand, silence all around. The room had changed, subtly. The sheets were fresh, the scuff on the wall beneath the hook had been scrubbed, though a faint trace remained. The wardrobe no longer smelled of old wool and cologne, and yet the air still held something. He thought again of the belt. Not the object itself, but the choice. Why that method? Why there in that room? He had spoken to no one in the final hours, and yet someone had been there, perhaps not in body, but in mind, a presence behind his thoughts, a weight. It was not death that had frightened Renault, it was the certainty that silence had run out. Maigret knocked gently on Madame Vernou's kitchen door. She let him in with a half glance. "I'll make coffee," she said, without being asked. They sat at the small table, steam rising from their mugs. A small clock ticked on the windowsill, measuring the moment by moment. "I still say it wasn't suicide," she said, voice low. Maigret didn't answer. "I've seen men give up," she went on. "They don't bring bread and cheese, they don't look at the clock when they eat, and they don't listen when you mention the weather." "What did he say?" She shook her head. "Not much, but when I said it might snow that night, he asked if the roads would be clear. He asked it like someone who had plans." They sat in silence for a while. "Did you see anyone near his room?" "No one who shouldn't have been here, but someone could have come in." She didn't answer at once. "There's a key rack. I leave them hanging at night. People come and go. I'm not always watching." Maigret took a slow sip. "Thank you." When he returned to Paris that evening, the city was slick with drizzle, the streets reflecting amber streetlights like mirrors held to the sky. His office at the Quai was quiet. Legrand had left early, and the typists had gone for the day. Maigret sat at his desk and opened the folder again, out of habit more than need. Renault's ID photo, the matches, the daisy, now pressed flat in a wax envelope. No crime, no suspect. And yet the shape of guilt hovered behind each object. He walked home. Madame Maigret was knitting by the fire, her feet tucked beneath her. She looked up and smiled when he came in. "You missed dinner," she said, as he shrugged off his coat. "I wasn't hungry." His coat. "I wasn't." She studied him for a moment, then returned to her knitting. "That woman from the inn wrote you again," she said. She asked if the man's name had really been Chabot. Maigret took the envelope from the table, opened it slowly. Madame Vernou's writing was tidy, unadorned. "Another guest came yesterday, a man in a brown hat, asked which room the salesman had stayed in. I told him it was no longer available. He left quickly, didn't ask again." Maigret folded the letter, placed it in his breast pocket. The next morning he met Marchand at the Gare de Lyon. The constable looked tired, his cap crooked, eyes shadowed. "You think he's circling back?" Marchand asked. "I think he's checking the silence," Maigret replied, "to see if it holds." They arrived at Marchand by mid-morning. Madame Vernou met them with folded arms and a thin-lipped frown. He didn't leave a name, paid in cash, asked too many questions, not enough conversation. Maigret asked her to sit with a police artist from the local gendarmerie. A composite sketch was made. Square face, thick eyebrows, brown wool coat, soft hands. Back in Paris, the composite led to a low-level courier named Léon Messier, former employee of Legrand's courier firm. Dismissed for suspected theft, never charged. Maigret found him living in a pension above a locksmith shop in the 13th arrondissement. The man answered the door in slippers, blinking into the hallway. Léon Messier, Maigret asked. Yes, I'd like a word. Inside, the room was narrow and hot. A kettle whistled faintly. Maigret gestured to the chair, waited. I'm not in trouble, am I? Messier asked, voice trembling. That depends, Maigret said. You visited the Auberge des Ombres 3 days ago. Messier said nothing. You asked about a man, the man who died. Messier ran a hand over his scalp. I didn't hurt anyone. Maigret's tone didn't change. But someone asked you to look. Messier nodded slowly. Legrand, he said he wanted to be sure that the man was really gone. Why? Messier looked at his knees. He said it was insurance. That if Renaud was really dead, then nothing else would come loose. Maigret stood. You'll come with me, and you'll write that down. At the Quai, Messier's statement was taken. It was clean, cautious, but it held weight. Legrand had asked him to confirm the man's death. That wasn't a crime, but it wasn't innocent either. When Maigret stepped out into the evening, the rain had started again. It fell lightly, almost politely. He didn't need to arrest Legrand. The man would know. He would read the newspapers, see the questions being asked again. The silence was no longer his. As Maigret walked home, he passed a florist's kiosk on the corner. Daisies, freshly cut, stood in a narrow bucket. He paused for a moment, then walked on. The next morning, Maigret woke before dawn. The light outside was bruised violet, the window panes still glazed from the rain. He sat at the edge of the bed, rubbing his forehead slowly, absently, before reaching for his slippers. Madame Maigret stirred behind him, but did not speak. She understood his silences better than most. By 7, he was seated at his usual table in the Café du Marché, the steam from his coffee rising in thin, spiraling tendrils. The waiter knew not to interrupt him when he lit his pipe and looked out the window with that far-off expression, the one that meant Maigret wasn't in the café at all, not truly, but somewhere down a hallway in his mind, walking slowly, listening for echoes. Léon Mercier's written statement lay folded in his coat pocket. It wasn't enough to reopen the case formally, and it wasn't enough to bring charges against Legrand, but it was enough to stir unease, enough to suggest that Renaud had been part of something fragile, a silence held together by a handful of people who were too careful, and one man who had finally broken. It was never the action that caught Maigret's attention. It was what surrounded it, the moments just before, the quiet after, the mood in a room when something had shifted and no one wanted to say so aloud. By 10 o'clock he was back at the Quai des Orfèvres, coat still damp, pipe unlit. He passed the clerks and uniformed officers with brief nods, then climbed the narrow stairs to his office where a cup of lukewarm tea and an unsharpened pencil awaited him. The rain had made everything dull, smudged as if Paris itself had been rubbed out slightly at the edges. There was a file on his desk when he arrived, not left by him, and not from his division. Tucked beneath it, a note in Inspector Logon's scrawl. Private inquiry. Thought you'd want it. Name, René Valine. Maigret frowned. Valine, the name didn't ring immediately, but as he opened the file, a slow recognition set in. Valine had been a minor accountant in one of the companies Legrand had managed investments through. He had resigned 2 years earlier, discreetly. No scandal, but the kind of departure that made no ripples, only because everyone had been careful not to throw stones. The report attached to the file was slim. Valine had been found dead in his apartment in the 17th arrondissement. Gas, a faulty valve, said the initial finding, but there had been no autopsy. The death had been closed within 48 hours. Maigret's eyes narrowed. He telephoned the clerk who had handled the original record. Valine, he said, did anyone ever inquire about that case? A pause, some shuffling of papers. No, Inspector. Quiet case. No family nearby. Who signed off on the final report? Deputy Inspector Verlaine. Retired last spring. That was all. A dead accountant, a quiet signature, a closed door. It could have been coincidence. But Maigret didn't believe in coincidence. Not when it echoed the same structure. A man who disappeared, then was found, alone, dead, without the fuss of investigation. He called Toulon again, spoke to the same inspector. Check your records, Maigret said. Anyone tied to Legrand who's died quietly. No violence, no scandal. The Toulon inspector made a low noise. We had a man jump from a hotel balcony last year. Émile Costa, courier off bookwork. You think? Check the dates. Check for overlap with Charles Renaud. When he hung up, Maigret sat back, pipe stem between his teeth, but unlit. The air in the office was close, almost heavy. He opened the window slightly. Outside, the sounds of Paris, carts, bells, voices, floated in on a thin breeze, indifferent to what he was assembling. The deaths were spaced too widely to suggest panic, too clean to suggest clumsiness, but there was rhythm to them, not violence but erasure. Renaud's was the only one that had cracked the silence, and only because perhaps it hadn't gone quite as expected. What had tipped it? Back at the Hotel Verviers, Legrand had not checked out. He remained registered, paid in full for the week. Maigret did not confront him. He didn't need to. His presence in the background was enough.
like a shadow on a stairwell that never vanished. Instead, Maigret waited. Each day he made quiet visits to the registry office, to the pension where Renaud had once lodged, to the postal station where a final unsent letter had been found. Each time, he carried no badge in hand, no urgency in his voice. The letter, though nearly destroyed, had yielded one line legible under ultraviolet light: "No longer safe. If anything happens, that was all." But Maigret did not need the rest. It was a letter never sent, because the writer never found the moment safe enough to send it. It was midweek when Annie returned to Paris. She had taken the train from Toulon quietly, with no luggage but a small handbag. Maigret met her at the station. "You said he left nothing," she told him as they walked. "Sometimes it's not what they leave but what they try not to take," Maigret replied. He brought her to a small café near the Palais de Justice, quiet, anonymous. They sat at the back.
He was afraid of one man, Maigret said, not of being caught, of being watched. Annie looked down at her cup. "He told me once he'd worked for someone who didn't believe in second chances. Legrand," she nodded slowly. "He never said the name, but he said there were jobs that had to end in silence." "Did he ever say why he left?" "He said he wanted to sleep through the night again." Maigret said nothing for a long moment. "Then he left you a flower." Annie's eyes glistened. "I pressed it into a book I never finished," she said. Maigret escorted her to her hotel, then walked alone down the Boulevard Saint-Michel. The city had begun to dry. The sun broke through in long slices, catching the domes and windows like silent applause. There would be no arrest, not yet, perhaps not ever, but there were cracks now, visible ones. People were remembering, names were appearing in old files, and in time, that would become weight enough to press the matter forward. Maigret returned to his office and found a single sheet of paper on his desk, typed, unmarked. It read, "Inspector, I have nothing to hide, but I have much to protect. Should your inquiries become official, I will of course cooperate. Mem L. No signature, no address." Maigret folded the letter and placed it in his drawer. There was no fear in Legrand's words, only calculation. But there had been a crack in the hallway outside the Hotel Verviers, a moment when the man had seen Annie, had seen Tissot and had paused, just once. But that was enough. Enough for Maigret to know that guilt, like dust, settled eventually, no matter how often it was swept aside. He returned home late. Madame Maigret had made stew, and the smell greeted him at the door. She looked up as he hung his coat and stepped into the warm light of the apartment. "Did you find what you needed?" she asked. He paused, then nodded. "No arrest?" she ventured. "No, but he knows I'm still here." They ate quietly, the window fogged from the warmth inside. Outside, rain began again, just a soft tapping against the glass as if the city itself were breathing. It had rained most of the night, and by morning Paris was grey in that soft, withdrawn way it often became at the tail end of autumn. Rainwater collected along the gutters of Boulevard, Rue Lenoir, reflecting the skeletal branches of the plane trees, their last few leaves clinging like stubborn memories. Maigret stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, pipe unlit. The stove ticked behind him as it cooled. Madame Maigret, still in her slippers, passed him a slice of bread with plum jam and said nothing. She knew when he was still inside a case, even one that no longer had a name, or paperwork or urgency. It was Friday. Maigret returned to the quay, not with any plan, but because some part of him wanted to listen, to the hallways, to the voices between voices. Sometimes it wasn't documents that broke a case open, but a sigh in the wrong corridor, a look exchanged near the elevator. At his office, he found nothing new on his desk. Just an envelope, not posted, not stamped, slipped beneath the door. He opened it carefully. Inside, a photograph, faded, not recent. Two men, standing near a car, both in shirt sleeves. One was unmistakably younger Renaud, the other harder to say. The angle was poor, the face turned slightly. But Maigret knew a composed posture when he saw one. There was something quiet in the stance of the second man, something in the way he kept his hands close to his sides, not clenched, not relaxed. A man used to being near danger without ever appearing part of it. There was no note, no handwriting, no return address. Maigret studied the photo for a long time, then placed it on his desk blotter. Who had left it? Annie? Tissot? Someone else? Someone who still wanted to speak but not allowed. He lit his pipe, finally, and watched the smoke drift toward the open window. Later that day, he returned to the Hotel Verviers. The concierge recognized him this time, and didn't even feign surprise. "Room 203, she said. "He's still here, leaves early, comes back late, never has visitors." Maigret climbed the stairs without hurry. Outside room 203, he paused, listening. No sound. He knocked, not firmly, but with intent. A moment passed, then the door opened. Legrand stood in the frame, tie loosened, jacket off, sleeves rolled. "Inspector," he said. Maigret didn't answer. He stepped inside without waiting for invitation. Legrand moved aside with a sigh more tired than angry. The room was as expected, neat, impersonal. A briefcase on the desk, open.
a thin ledger beside it, the curtains drawn but not tightly, the kind of room a man kept when he didn't plan to stay but might. I received something this morning, Maigret said. He reached into his coat and placed the photo on the desk. Legrand looked at it for a long time. Do you know who took it? Maigret asked. No. Do you remember when it was taken? Legrand leaned on the desk. His hands remained flat. It was 6 years ago, Marseille. The man beside me had just delivered a package from North Africa. It was routine. I don't recall who took the picture. He died last year. Legrand blinked. Costa jumped from a hotel balcony in Toulon. A pause. You have nothing official, Legrand said. I don't need anything official, Maigret replied. Legrand sat on the edge of the bed, exhaling through his nose. There's nothing I can be charged with. Perhaps. Maigret remained standing. The rain had started again, a faint pattering against the window. But something troubles you, Maigret said softly. You've stayed in this hotel longer than you need to. You've asked no questions. You've visited no one. But you haven't left. Legrand looked up. You've been waiting, Maigret continued. For what? For someone else to fall? For silence to resume? Or simply to see if I would stop? A long silence. Then, I didn't kill him, Legrand said. No, Maigret said, but you created the silence he died in. Legrand stared at the floor. He left a life behind, Maigret said. One that frightened him. One he thought could be outrun. But it followed him, not because you sent someone, not directly, but because you trained him to believe that no one could leave, that someone would always come. Legrand's voice was very quiet. It was never personal. Maigret shook his head slowly. That's the most dangerous kind. He picked up the photograph, returned it to his coat pocket. I won't arrest you, he said, but you'll be followed. You'll be spoken of, quietly but often. Your name will be linked to a death that should never have happened, and every time someone leaves your orbit, they'll wonder if silence is the price of escape. He turned to leave. At the door he paused. One last thing. The woman, Annie. Legrand looked up. She remembers his kindness, Maigret said. That's more than anything they'll remember of you.
And then he left. Outside, the rain had slowed again to a whisper. Maigret walked without hurry. The streets gleamed beneath the lamplight. Everything was the same, and yet something had shifted. Not legally, not bureaucratically, but in the quiet undercurrent where Maigret did his best work. At the Quai, he filed the photograph under a manila folder labeled simply, Renault. There was no need for further notes. The case had no conclusion, but it no longer needed one. Some stories, he had long believed, ended not with answers but with the simple presence of the right questions. When he returned home, Madame Maigret was reading. She looked up from her armchair and smiled. Did it rain all day? Most of it, he said. Was it worth the umbrella? He smiled faintly. Not for the rain. She didn't ask more. He poured himself a beer, sat down and watched the city through the window. The mist rising, the silhouettes of chimneys, the glisten of rooftops like soaked slate. Renault's death would not be explained in newspapers. Legrand would not be tried. But the silence that had swallowed others had thinned, just enough. Sometimes that was all justice allowed. The days passed quietly. Legrand remained in Paris for another week, then left without fanfare. No note, no farewell, just a discreet checkout from the Hotel Verviers and a signature written in the same controlled hand as always. Maigret didn't follow him. He had no intention of chasing a man who had already condemned himself, not by law but by life. The silence that Legrand had built so carefully was beginning to echo, not publicly, not yet. But Maigret could sense it in the quiet stirrings of the office, in the subtle questions exchanged in corridors at Quai d'Orfèvres. You remember that courier firm? Whatever happened to Charles Renault? Strange case, wasn't it? And always, those questions led back to nothing, to shadows. But Maigret knew better. He had stood in the rooms those men had died in. He had smelled the final hours. He had heard the hesitation in voices, the kind that spoke not of innocence, but of obedience, of people who knew they had crossed a line, not with violence, but by simply wanting to leave something behind. It was the obedience that bothered Maigret most. One morning, a week after Legrand's departure, he received a letter. No return address. Inside was a train ticket, second class, one way, Toulon to Paris, dated 3 weeks prior. The stub had been folded neatly, precisely. There was nothing else in the envelope. No explanation, no name. But Maigret understood it. Someone, perhaps Annie, had sent it, or someone who had watched Renault board that train. A fragment of a story, mailed like an apology. That same afternoon, Maigret returned to Montgeron. The weather had turned again, low sunlight filtering through thinning clouds, dappling the pavement in gold and silver. He didn't announce his visit. At the Auberge des Ombres, Madame Vernou was peeling potatoes behind the counter. She barely looked up as he entered. He's still dead, she said simply. I know, not coming back to life with all your papers and questions. Maigret smiled faintly. No, he asked for a room, not room 4, one of the others. She gave him room 6 without comment. Later, he sat again in the small dining room, drinking a glass of red wine with a slice of bread. The same cat still hovered by the stove, indifferent and warm. It was a quiet night. Only one other guest,
a man in his 60s with thick glasses and a newspaper folded beside him. The inn had returned to its stillness, but Maigret could feel something different. Not a ghost. Maigret didn't believe in ghosts, but an impression. Renaud had left something behind, not an object, a trace of thought, a feeling, fragile and persistent. That night, Maigret lay in the narrow bed of room 6 and listened to the creaks of the old house, the groan of the stairs, the quiet stretch of timber, the wind brushing against the shutter slats, all perfectly ordinary. But at midnight, he rose, he walked barefoot to the hallway and stood before room 4. He didn't open it, he just listened. Behind the door, nothing, not a sound. Still, he stood there for a long time, arms crossed, eyes closed. It wasn't silence that held the room, it was memory. Of someone waiting, folding his shirt with slow hands, placing a loaf of bread and a package of cheese, just so, perhaps believing he'd eat them in the morning. A man who had pressed a flower into tissue paper, not as a gesture of romance, but to preserve something honest in a world that had asked for silence. Back in Paris the next morning, Maigret took his time walking to the office. The markets were open, and he paused to watch a fishmonger arrange sprats in neat rows. A child beside the stall pointed at a crab and shrieked with delight. Life moved on. At the quay, Lagnon was waiting, arms folded. "There's a journalist asking questions," he said. "About Renaud, about you." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "Says he heard the death might not have been suicide." "It was," Maigret replied. "But it was suicide," he repeated. "But that doesn't mean he wanted to die." Lagnon frowned, confused, but said nothing more. Maigret walked to his office and closed the door gently. He opened the drawer where he had placed the file, the thin one marked Renaud. He added the train ticket to it, along with a small note, "No official inquiry. Quiet follow-up advised. Name to watch, Maurice Legrand." He paused, then added one more sentence. "Observe the ones who remain silent too long." That afternoon he met Annie for coffee. She had come to Paris for a job interview, waitress at a hotel near Saint-Lazare. She was hopeful, though she didn't say it aloud. "How do you sleep now?" Maigret asked gently. "Better," she said. "Not because anything changed, just because I know someone saw him." They sat a long while in silence. When she left, he watched her disappear into the crowd. Small handbag, firm steps, head slightly bowed. A figure among many, but one he would remember. That evening, Maigret sat once more at home with Madame Maigret. She had made beef stew. The smell filled the flat, heavy with thyme and onion. He ate quietly. When he finished, she asked, "Do you feel it's finished?" "No," he said, "but I feel it's settled." She nodded. "Sometimes that's better." They washed the dishes together. Outside, the rain had returned, not with violence but with persistence, a slow, steady tapping against the windows, soft as breath. And Maigret stood by the glass for a long while, looking out. No arrests, no verdicts, but a name had been remembered. A silence had been broken, and somewhere someone would think twice before expecting obedience without question. Sometimes that was enough.